Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be told you don't belong, even when you know you've earned your place? On Flight 378, a young black boy named Jonathan sat quietly in the first-class seat his father had rewarded him for months of hard work. Yet, within minutes, a flight attendant stood above him, certain he didn't belong there. No system check, no ticket scan, just judgment. What would you do if it were your child humiliated in front of strangers, forced to walk down the aisle with silent eyes watching? Would you stay quiet, or would you demand the truth? This story is not just about a flight. It is about dignity, choice, and the courage to stand when silence feels safer. And it forces us to ask, if it had been me in that seat, how would I have wanted the world to respond? Stay with us, because what unfolded on that plane changed more than one journey. It shook an entire system. If this story moves you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing powerful stories that matter. Let's step together into the story of Jonathan and his father's fight for justice. The cabin lights glowed with a warm golden hue, soft enough to soothe the eyes but bright enough to highlight the details that made first class feel like another world. Plush leather seats stood in neat rows, wide enough that even the tallest passenger could stretch without brushing against their neighbor. Overhead, bins clicked shut one after another as travelers settled into their places, pulling out tablets, novels, or noise-canceling headphones. Jonathan Miles sat quietly in seat 3A, his small hands folded neatly over the boarding pass that had been checked at the gate. He was only 13, but his posture carried a surprising composure, as if he already knew the world was watching. He tucked his backpack beneath the seat, exhaled softly, and let his gaze drift toward the oval window. Beyond the glass, the bustle of ground crew vehicles moved with mechanical rhythm. Orange vests glowing under the floodlights of JFK International, it was Jonathan's very first time flying alone. His father, Richard Miles, had promised him this trip for months. "You've earned it," Richard had said just last week, his deep voice calm but proud. Jonathan had worked hard all year, bringing home straight A's and surprising even his teachers with an award-winning essay on American history. This flight to Los Angeles was not just a reward, it was a symbol, a way of showing Jonathan that effort, discipline, and integrity had value in the world. Jonathan's heart beat faster than he let on. He wanted to appear calm, grown up, worthy of the trust his father had placed in him. But inside, nerves fluttered like restless birds. He clutched the armrest once, then released it, reminding himself, "You belong here. Dad said you belong here." The aisle hummed with the sound of luggage wheels and polite greetings. Businessmen murmured into phones, their voices clipped and efficient. A woman in pearls adjusted her scarf with the grace of habit. Jonathan noticed details: the faint smell of citrus from the hot towels, the smooth touch of the leather seat beneath his palms, the way first class seemed insulated from the chaos of the terminal he had just left behind. For a moment, he allowed himself to smile. That smile faded when a shadow fell across him. "Excuse me, young man." Jonathan looked up. A tall woman in her early 50s stood over him. Her uniform was pressed, her hair pulled into a tight bun, and her name tag gleamed, Ms. Caldwell. Her voice was sharp but measured, the kind of tone adults used when they already doubted your answer. "Yes, ma'am," Jonathan replied, his voice polite, steady. Her eyes scanned him quickly, almost dismissively. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jonathan's heart skipped. He straightened his back, trying not to sound uncertain. "Yes, ma'am. This is 3A. He reached into his hoodie pocket, pulled out the boarding pass, and held it up. "Ms." Caldwell barely glanced at the ticket before shaking her head. "This is first class," she said slowly, as though explaining something he couldn't possibly understand. Jonathan nodded. "I know. My dad bought this ticket for me." Her lips tightened. Around them, a few passengers glanced up from their screens. A man across the aisle raised his eyebrows but quickly lowered his gaze back to his laptop. Another shifted in his seat, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. "And where are your parents, Ms.?" Caldwell asked, her patience thinning. "I'm traveling alone." The woman sighed, her eyes narrowing. There must have been some mistake. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers only." Jonathan felt the heat creep up his neck. He glanced at his ticket again, making sure the bold black print still read 3A, first class. It was right there. The proof. Yet somehow, it didn't matter. "I think this is my seat," he said softly, gripping the ticket tighter. A thin smile crossed Caldwell's lips, but it wasn't kind. "Gather your things, please. You'll need to move to the back. There's been some confusion." Jonathan's stomach sank. His first instinct was to argue, but the weight of every eye in the cabin pressed down on him. He felt their silent judgment, their curiosity, their relief that it wasn't them being singled out. His throat tightened. He wasn't being difficult. He wasn't causing trouble. But every second he sat there, it felt harder to fight back. Slowly, reluctantly. Jonathan reached down for his backpack. His legs trembled as he rose from the wide, comfortable seat. Ms. Caldwell didn't offer to help, offer to. She simply turned, gesturing curtly toward the rear of the plane. The walk down the aisle was the longest of his young life. Row after row of passengers watched in silence. Some lowered their eyes, some shifted uncomfortably. A few whispered behind hands, but no one said a word. The plush carpet of first class gave way to the narrower, more crowded rows of economy. The air felt heavier here, the seats cramped, the chatter louder. Jonathan slid into an empty seat by the window, staring out as if the world outside might offer an escape. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Quickly, with hands still trembling, he pulled it out and began typing. "They made me move to the back, said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket, but she didn't believe me." The reply came almost instantly. "What do you mean they made you move?" "Who made you move?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake." She wouldn't listen. There was a pause, long enough to make Jonathan's heart pound. Then another message appeared on the screen. "What's the flight number?" Jonathan typed quickly. "Atlas Airlines, Flight 378. A final message appeared. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." Jonathan leaned back, exhaling shakily. He didn't know what his father meant, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't over. Back in Manhattan, long before Jonathan ever boarded Flight 378, his father, Richard Miles, had spent hours weighing the decision to let his son travel alone. To outsiders, Richard was a figure of authority and quiet power. A tall man in his late 40s with calm eyes that concealed the storms he had endured throughout his life. He had built himself up from scholarship student to CEO, navigating boardrooms where he was often the only black executive at the table. He knew what prejudice looked like. He had tasted it in the hesitation of a handshake, in the doubting glance before a contract was signed, in the unspoken assumption that he had been lucky rather than capable. And yet, he had persevered. When Jonathan earned straight A's this year, Richard had promised him something memorable. Not another video game console or a bicycle, but something symbolic. A first-class trip across the country to visit his aunt in Los Angeles. A journey that said, "You belong in the best spaces. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Richard had walked Jonathan to the gate himself that morning. The boy had carried his backpack, filled neatly with books, headphones, and the essay that had won him first prize in his school competition. Richard had crouched slightly so they were eye level. "You know what this seat means?" son Richard asked, his voice low. Jonathan shrugged. "That I get to sit in the comfy section." Richard chuckled softly. "More than that. It means you've earned it. It means you deserve to be there. Just like anyone else, no one can take that away from you. Remember that." Jonathan nodded, but Richard saw the flicker of nerves in his eyes. He placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "Stay calm. If anyone questions you, just show them your ticket. Speak with confidence. You have every right to that seat." Jonathan's small voice replied, "Yes, Dad." They hugged, a brief but firm embrace, watching his son walk toward the jet bridge. Richard felt pride swell in his chest and an old, gnawing worry in the back of his mind. Now, hours later, as he sat in his corner office overlooking the sprawl of Manhattan, Richard's phone buzzed with the message that made his heart tighten. "They made me move to the back. Said I couldn't sit in first class." For a split second, his carefully built composure cracked. His jaw tightened and his fingers curled into a fist. Memories rushed back, being turned away from a private club despite his membership, being mistaken for the driver when he was the one who owned the car. He had taught himself to remain calm, to let his actions prove his worth. But now, it wasn't his dignity under attack. It was his son's. Richard read the second message, then the third. His son's words were simple, but the pain underneath them was clear. He typed quickly, "Stay where you are. I'll handle this." He didn't want Jonathan to feel fear. He didn't want him to think anger was the only answer. But he would not let this go unchallenged. Richard rose from his chair and pressed a button on his desk phone. His assistant's voice answered immediately. "Yes, Mr. Miles, get me William Foster. Now." There was a pause, then a quick, "Right away." "Sir." Richard paced to the window, staring down at the blur of yellow cabs and pedestrians. His reflection looked back at him, tall and controlled, but his chest burned with the memory of his son's voice. "This is my seat. You saw my ticket." When the call connected, William Foster's voice came through, cautious and respectful. "Richard, what can I do for you? My son is on Atlas Flight 378. Richard said, his tone measured but firm. He was seated in first class, in seat 3A. A flight attendant removed him without cause. There was a silence on the line. Richard imagined Foster glancing around his office, searching for the right words. That shouldn't have happened. Foster finally said, "I'll contact the crew immediately." "No," Richard interrupted. His voice sharpened, though it never rose. "This is not about a quick apology. This is about accountability. I want the situation addressed before that plane lands. And I want it clear that this is not the way Atlas treats its passengers, any passenger." "I understand," Foster said quickly. "I'll make sure it's handled." Richard ended the call, exhaling slowly. He loosened his tie, but the weight in his chest remained. He thought about Jonathan, sitting alone in the back of that plane, surrounded by strangers, wondering why he didn't belong. Richard sat back at his desk, steepling his fingers. He had built his life teaching himself restraint, believing dignity was the strongest form of power, but this time restraint alone would not be enough. Meanwhile, high above the ground, Jonathan sat with his phone in hand, rereading his father's last message. "Stay where you are. I'll handle this." Jonathan's lips pressed together. He trusted his father. He always had. But he couldn't shake the question gnawing at his chest. Why did she think I didn't belong for the first time that day? He wished his father were sitting beside him to remind him again, in that steady voice, "You deserve this seat. You've earned it." Instead, Jonathan leaned his head against the cold window and watched the clouds gather in the distance. Jonathan tried to focus on the hum of the engines, a steady vibration under his seat that reminded him of the sound of the subway back home. The noise should have been comforting, but here in economy, crammed between two strangers, it felt suffocating. His legs pressed against the seat in front of him, and the faint smell of reheated meals drifted from the galley behind. He closed his eyes, trying to remember his father's last words that morning at the gate. "You deserve to be there. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But someone had. And the silence of everyone else made it worse. Back in first class, Ms. Caldwell smoothed her uniform with a satisfied air. To her, the situation was resolved. Another mistake corrected. She leaned against the service counter, scanning the cabin. To her right, a man in a tailored suit gave her a faint nod of approval. She interpreted it as silent support. To her, this was confirmation she had done the right thing. At her side, Emily Parker, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, arranged glasses of sparkling water on a tray. Her hands shook slightly, causing the liquid to ripple against the rims. She had seen everything the way Jonathan had held out his boarding pass, the way his voice had carried both politeness and quiet desperation. Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "Ms. Caldwell," she began softly. "Are you sure there wasn't a mistake? His ticket, it looked like it said 3A. Caldwell scoffed, adjusting the pin on her lapel. "Please. Emily, you've been here, 6 months? I've done this job for 20 years. I know when someone doesn't belong." But Emily hesitated, glancing at the empty seat Jonathan had been forced to leave. "You didn't check the manifest." Caldwell's eyes hardened. "Don't question me. Trust your instincts. That boy clearly wasn't supposed to be here." Can you imagine a child like that in first class alone? Emily's stomach twisted. She had served passengers of every background, every age, every income. She had seen elderly couples clasping hands, teenagers clutching gaming consoles, and mothers balancing babies on their laps. People of all kinds filled these seats, and yet, the way Caldwell said that boy made it clear this wasn't about age. Emily bit her tongue. She had already learned the dangers of pushing back. Caldwell had a reputation respected by supervisors, feared by colleagues. Crossing her could mean the end of a career that had barely begun. Still, the image of Jonathan's face lingered in Emily's mind, the confusion, the quiet hurt in his eyes. In economy. Jonathan opened his backpack and pulled out the essay his father had insisted he bring. The pages were neatly stapled, his name typed boldly at the top, Jonathan Miles, 7th grade. First prize. He traced the letters absent-mindedly with his finger. It was proof, in some strange way, that he could accomplish things people didn't expect of him. But what good was an essay prize against the judgment of someone who hadn't even looked at his ticket? A flight attendant passing by paused. "Would you like a drink, sweetheart?" she asked kindly. Jonathan shook his head. "No, thank you." His voice was polite, but inside, a storm brewed. He hated that word, sweetheart. It made him feel smaller, like he didn't matter. His phone buzzed again. Another message from his father. "Remember, stay calm. This isn't about them. It's about you knowing your worth." Jonathan typed back quickly, "I'm trying." "Dad, but it feels like everyone agrees with her." The reply came seconds later. "They don't. Silence doesn't mean agreement. Sometimes it means fear. Let me show you." Jonathan frowned. He didn't quite understand what his father meant, but the certainty in those words steadied him. Meanwhile, at 30,000 feet, tension began to seep into the air. A woman in seat 2C whispered to her husband. A man across the aisle glanced back toward economy more than once, clearly unsettled. People had noticed more than Caldwell believed. Back in the galley, Emily set down the tray with a clatter louder than she intended. Caldwell shot her a sharp look. "Careful," Caldwell muttered. Emily lowered her voice, almost a whisper. "You didn't even give him a chance." Caldwell's nostrils flared. "You're young. You'll learn. First class is for passengers who belong here. That boy will thank me one day for saving him from embarrassment." Emily wanted to scream. Instead, she clenched her jaw and returned to the cabin, forcing a smile as she distributed drinks. But her thoughts churned. She had joined Atlas Airlines because she believed in hospitality, in dignity for all. If this was what experience looked like, did she even want to last 20 years here at that very moment? The intercom buzzed softly. "Ms. Caldwell, please report to the cockpit." The words cut through the air like a blade. Several passengers glanced up. Caldwell stiffened, tugging at her jacket. It was unusual for a flight attendant to be summoned mid-service. Emily froze. She had a sudden, unshakable sense that something bigger was unfolding. Caldwell turned on her heel and strode down the aisle, her shoes clicking against the carpet. As she passed, Emily caught sight of the faintest tremor in her hands. For the first time, Caldwell didn't look certain. Jonathan, sitting silently in economy, lifted his head. He watched as the senior attendant disappeared into the cockpit, the door closing firmly behind her. His phone buzzed again. A single message from his father. "It's beginning." Jonathan's heart raced. He didn't know what his father had done, but he sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet. In the cockpit, the captain glanced at Caldwell with a mixture of discomfort and resolve. The small monitor mounted near the radio crackled to life. On the screen, Richard Miles's face appeared calm, stern, unflinching. "Ms. Caldwell," the captain said gravely, "you need to listen." For the first time that day, the confident flight attendant felt the color drain from her face. The hum of conversation in economy wrapped itself around Jonathan like a fog he couldn't escape. People leaned into their seats, flipping through magazines or tapping at phones, but he felt eyes slide toward him every so often. He wondered if they knew. If they had seen him escorted down the aisle, stripped of a seat he had a right to. He pulled his hoodie tighter, hiding the name embroidered on his backpack, Jonathan Miles. He tried to breathe evenly. His father's words were still in his head. "Stay calm. I'll handle this." But what did staying calm mean when every part of him burned with shame? A little girl across the aisle peeked over the armrest, her wide eyes curious. Jonathan forced a small smile, but she turned away, shy. It made him ache. He didn't want pity. He wanted to belong where his father said he belonged, at the front of the plane. "Ms." Caldwell stood stiffly in the cockpit doorway, her composure cracking under the weight of Richard Miles's steady gaze on the small monitor. The captain folded his arms, his voice grave. "Mr. Miles is the principal shareholder of this airline," he said, "and his son was seated in 3A legally, properly. You removed him without checking the system." Caldwell opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. Her skin prickled under the captain's tone and under the silent authority radiating from the man on the screen. Richard's expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a weight she had not expected. "You are going to return to economy," Richard said evenly, "and you are going to escort my son back to his seat. You will do so respectfully. Then, when this plane lands, you will explain your actions to the board." The line went dead. The cabin filled with the drone of the engines again, but inside Caldwell's head there was only noise, the pounding of her pulse, the rising tide of panic she had never felt in 20 years of service. She smoothed her jacket, lifted her chin, and forced her legs to carry her back into the cabin. Every step felt heavier than the last. Jonathan's phone buzzed. He looked down. A new message from his father. "She's coming to you now. Hold your ground." Jonathan straightened in his cramped seat, though his stomach twisted in knots. He had never been good at confrontation. He wanted to vanish, to disappear into the hum of the plane. But his father's words echoed. "Hold your ground." Caldwell spotted him instantly. He was sitting near the window, staring out, shoulders square but small against the seat. She cleared her throat, lowering herself slightly to his level. Her voice, which had carried steel earlier, was subdued now. "Sir," she said, the word catching in her throat. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Jonathan turned his head slowly, his expression calm but unreadable. Passengers nearby glanced over, sensing something important unfolding. "A misunderstanding," Jonathan repeated. His voice was soft but steady. Caldwell nodded quickly. "Yes. There was an error in seating. I'd like to correct it now." Jonathan tilted his head. "I had my ticket. You saw it. You still told me to move." The murmurs around them grew louder. People who had looked away before now shifted, listening. They knew the boy was right. Caldwell swallowed hard. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she admitted, each word tasting like ash. "But I'd like to correct it now. Please come with me." Jonathan didn't move. He looked at her, eyes steady, silence stretching longer than she could endure. Then he reached for his phone, tapped a quick message. A moment later, Caldwell's work tablet vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. A forwarded message from the executive office flashed across the screen. "Take your time. Make her understand what she did." Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just about moving him back. This was about facing what she had done. Jonathan's voice cut through the heavy silence. "I'll go back, but I want to know why you thought I didn't belong there." The question hung in the air like a challenge no training manual had ever prepared her for. For the first time in 2 decades, Caldwell felt the floor tilt beneath her. She was no longer the one enforcing rules. She was the one being judged. In the front rows of economy, a man cleared his throat uncomfortably. Another passenger shifted, her eyes sharp with disapproval. Emily Parker, standing frozen a few rows away, felt her chest tighten. She wanted to step in, to say out loud what everyone knew that Caldwell hadn't checked, hadn't cared, had simply assumed. But the boy's quiet dignity carried more weight than anything Emily could have said. Caldwell's face burned. Her voice faltered. I can't answer that." Jonathan held her gaze a moment longer, then finally stood. He slung his backpack over one shoulder, still holding his boarding pass like a shield. The cabin watched as he walked past row after row, following the very woman who had stripped him of dignity minutes before. Passengers whispered now, but not in Caldwell's favor. A few shook their heads. One woman muttered under her breath, "Disgraceful." Jonathan slipped back into 3A, adjusting himself into the wide leather seat. He opened the in-flight magazine with deliberate calm, as if reclaiming what was his required no fanfare. Caldwell lingered by the aisle, the eyes of the cabin burning into her. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to do. In Manhattan, the late afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows of Richard Miles's office, washing the room in amber light. He sat at his desk, phone still warm in his hand, his body rigid with a calm fury that no one outside the room would have guessed. The city buzzed below him, taxis honking, voices rising from the streets, but all Richard heard was his son's quiet question from thousands of feet in the air. Why did she think I didn't belong there? He leaned back in his leather chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Memories surfaced uninvited. He was 16 again, walking into a department store in Atlanta, holding money he had saved for months. The salesman had looked at him once, then passed him, pretending not to see him until Richard cleared his throat. "We don't carry anything in your size." The man had lied. Richard had left empty-handed, his self-worth dented but not broken. Then college. A professor had handed back his essay with a raised eyebrow. "Did you write this yourself?" Suspicion disguised as a question. Richard had earned an A but walked back to his dorm with the bitter taste of doubt in his mouth. He thought of boardrooms later, men in suits shaking his hand, congratulating him on deals, but always with that glint in their eyes, the one that asked silently, "How did you get here?" He had swallowed those moments, turned them into fuel. He had built companies, shattered expectations, and risen higher than any of those men could imagine. Yet, for all his triumphs, he could not shield his son from the sting of prejudice at 30,000 feet. His phone rang again. William Foster's voice filled the room. "Richard, I've spoken with the captain. The situation is being corrected. Your son is back in his seat." Richard's jaw flexed. "That isn't enough. William, this isn't about one seat. This is about a culture that tells people like my son that they don't belong, no matter what ticket they hold." "I agree," Foster said, his tone cautious. "We'll review her conduct." "I promise promises don't change behavior," Richard interrupted. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of finality. "I want accountability. I want training. I want policies that make it impossible for this to happen again, and I want it on record before that plane lands." There was silence on the line. Richard could almost hear Foster calculating the cost of scandal, the weight of public opinion, the risk of losing the support of the man who owned the largest stake in Atlas Airlines. Finally, Foster spoke. "Consider it done. I'll draft a statement for the board tonight." Richard ended the call. He stood and crossed the room to the wide window, gazing at the skyline. The Empire State Building cut into the fading sky, a symbol of endurance. He pressed a hand against the glass, steadying himself. His phone buzzed again. A new message from Jonathan. I asked her why. She couldn't answer. Richard's throat tightened. He could see his son in his mind's eye, small in size, but taller in spirit than anyone else in that cabin. A boy who didn't raise his voice, who didn't throw a tantrum, but simply asked the question that exposed the truth. "I'm proud of you," Richard typed back. "You didn't let her break you." Jonathan's reply came a minute later. "I stayed calm, like you said, but Dad, it still hurt." Richard's eyes stung. He allowed himself one deep breath, slow and steady, before responding. "I know, and that's why it has to change." He turned from the window, grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked toward the door. His assistant looked up from her desk, startled by the determination etched across his face. "Cancel my evening schedule," Richard said, "and prepare a conference line with the board. We're not waiting until tomorrow." "Yes, Mr. Miles," she replied, already reaching for the phone. Richard stepped into the private elevator, the doors sliding shut with a soft thud. As the elevator descended, his reflection stared back at him in the mirrored walls. He thought of Jonathan again, sitting alone in a world that had told him no. Richard whispered under his breath, a vow only he could hear. Never again. On the plane. Jonathan held his phone in both hands, rereading his father's words. "I'm proud of you. It warmed him, but the ache lingered. Around him, first-class passengers shifted, pretending to read, pretending not to have heard everything. The silence pressed heavy, but Jonathan straightened in his seat. He unfolded his essay and read the first line to himself. "Freedom is not given, it is claimed." He smiled faintly. Maybe his father was right. Maybe dignity itself was a kind of revenge. Emily Parker moved slowly down the aisle with a tray of drinks balanced in her hands. Her smile was professional, practiced, but her chest felt tight. Every time she passed row 3, her eyes flicked toward Jonathan. He sat in his wide leather seat, small frame pressed against the window, flipping through the in-flight magazine as if nothing had happened. But Emily had seen everything, and she couldn't unsee it. Passengers noticed, too. A businessman in 2B had watched Caldwell escort Jonathan back, his expression stiff. A woman across the aisle had whispered to her husband, shaking her head. The air in first class was different now, heavier, charged with an unspoken awareness. People weren't comfortable. They were complicit. Emily stopped briefly at 2A, setting down a glass of sparkling water. Her hands trembled, spilling a drop onto the napkin. She apologized quickly, moving on, but inside, her thoughts raced. She remembered her first weeks of training, when instructors drilled into her the golden rule: dignity above all. Every passenger, every time. She had believed in those words. They were why she joined Atlas Airlines. Hospitality wasn't about serving drinks, it was about seeing people, making them feel they mattered. But what had she done just an hour ago? She had stood by silently while Caldwell humiliated a child. In the galley, away from passenger eyes. Emily set the tray down harder than she meant to. Her colleague glanced up but said nothing. She pressed her palms against the counter, willing herself to breathe. "You should have said something," a voice inside her whispered. Another voice, louder, shot back. "And risk your job, Caldwell would crush you. She's untouchable. One complaint from her, and you'll be gone." Emily's stomach churned. She had bills, student loans, a tiny apartment she could barely afford. She couldn't afford to lose this job, but could she afford the guilt of silence? She thought of Jonathan's face as he asked Caldwell the question. "Why did you think I didn't belong?" His voice had been steady, but his eyes, they had carried the same question Emily had been asking herself since she watched him walk down the aisle. "Why didn't you stand up for me?" The cockpit door opened briefly. Caldwell emerged, her face pale and lips pressed thin. She avoided Emily's eyes, moving briskly to the galley phone. Emily heard her speaking in low, clipped tones, but couldn't catch the words. When Caldwell hung up, she smoothed her jacket and forced composure back onto her face. Emily swallowed. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. Caldwell's eyes snapped to her, cold and sharp. "Everything is under control. Focus on your service." The younger attendant nodded, but her fists tightened behind her back. Caldwell's confidence was crumbling. Emily could see it. But still, she strutted down the aisle as if she held all the authority in the world. Passengers weren't convinced. In 4C, a man lowered his newspaper and stared openly as Caldwell passed. A teenager in 5A pulled out his phone, subtly recording. People had begun to notice not just Jonathan, but the way the crew handled him. Back in first class, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. "I'm with the board now." His father's message read, "Stay calm. You're not alone in this." Jonathan looked up. Emily was standing nearby, offering drinks to another passenger. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Hers were wide, uncertain, almost apologetic. Jonathan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "I see you too." The gesture pierced Emily more deeply than any accusation could have. She returned to the galley, her thoughts louder than the roar of the engines. Caldwell joined her minutes later, muttering under her breath, "I won't be humiliated like this. 20 years of service, and they question me because of a boy ridiculous." Emily's breath caught. "But he showed you his ticket," she said softly. Caldwell froze, her eyes narrowing. "Be careful, Emily." The younger attendant felt her cheeks flush, but this time she didn't look away. Maybe being careful is what got us here. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The hum of the plane filled the gap. Caldwell's jaw tightened. She turned sharply and left without another word. Emily leaned against the counter, heart pounding. She had never spoken back before. Her whole body trembled with fear, but also with something else, relief. A tiny crack had formed in her silence. In the cabin. Jonathan set down the magazine and folded his hands. He could feel the weight of eyes around him, some sympathetic, some curious, some guilty. But he kept his back straight. His father always said that dignity was a shield no one could take from you. And somewhere deep in the plane, Emily Parker decided that maybe dignity was something you could fight for, not just for yourself, but for someone else too. The cockpit of Flight 378 was quiet, except for the low murmur of instruments and the steady drone of the engines outside. The captain, a seasoned pilot named Howard Mitchell, sat rigid in his seat, eyes flicking from the horizon to the woman standing beside him, Ms. Caldwell clasped her hands behind her back, her composure strained. The small monitor mounted near the radio glowed with an image that unsettled her more than turbulence ever could. On the screen, Richard Miles appeared, framed by the polished wood and glass of his Manhattan office. His expression was calm, almost too calm, the kind of composure that made every word feel heavier than a raised voice ever could. "Ms. Caldwell," the captain began carefully, "this is Mr. Richard Miles. He isn't just a passenger's parent. He is the principal shareholder of Atlas Airlines, and his son is sitting in this cabin." Caldwell felt the blood drain from her face. She tried to summon the authority she had relied on for years, but the edges of it slipped away under Richard's gaze. She swallowed, her throat dry. "I wasn't aware." Richard's voice cut through. "You weren't aware because you didn't check. You saw a child, and you made a judgment. You didn't look at the manifest. You didn't scan the ticket. You didn't do your job." The words landed like stones. Caldwell gripped her hands tighter, nails pressing into her palms. Richard leaned forward slightly, his tone unchanging. "You are going to return to the cabin. You are going to escort my son back to his seat with the respect he deserved the moment he boarded this plane. And when this aircraft lands, you will answer for your actions in front of the board. Do you understand me? For the first time in 20 years of service." Ms. Caldwell could not find her voice. The captain's eyes stayed fixed on her, offering no shield. Finally, she nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." The screen went dark. Silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the hum of the engines. Caldwell smoothed her jacket and turned, but her hands trembled as she gripped the door handle. In first class. Jonathan sat still, eyes on the window, but his pulse raced. He had seen Caldwell walk past minutes ago, pale and unsettled, heading to the cockpit. Now he waited, heart thudding, knowing something was coming. His phone buzzed once more. "Stay steady," his father had written. "She'll be with you soon. Remember who you are." Jonathan tucked the phone away. He straightened in his seat, gripping the armrest gently, steadying his breathing. The door opened. Caldwell stepped back into the cabin, every passenger's eyes shifting toward her. For years, she had thrived on attention, on the respect her uniform demanded, but this attention was different, heavy, watchful. She walked down the aisle, each step dragging. When she reached Jonathan, she crouched slightly, her voice quieter than before. "Sir," she said, the word catching in her throat. "There was a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Jonathan turned, his gaze steady. Around him, passengers leaned in subtly, pretending to read, but listening intently. He let the silence stretch before he spoke. "A misunderstanding," Caldwell nodded quickly. "Yes, an error in seating. I'd like to correct it now." Jonathan's hands tightened on the armrest. He remembered his father's words, "Stay steady." He remembered the humiliation of walking down the aisle, the burning in his cheeks as people watched but said nothing. And he remembered the question that had lodged itself in his chest, why he looked at her directly. "I showed you my ticket. You still told me to move. Why did you think I didn't belong?" The question cut through the hum of the cabin. Conversations died. A woman in 2C set her magazine down, eyes widening. A man in 4D shifted uncomfortably, staring at Caldwell. Caldwell's face flushed. For the first time, she had no ready answer. Her authority, her 2 decades of service, her practiced smile, none of it could shield her now. Emily Parker froze near the galley, tray in hand. Her chest tightened. She wanted to step forward, to say what she had seen, but Jonathan's quiet dignity held the floor more powerfully than any defense could. Passengers waited. Jonathan's gaze did not waver. Caldwell's lips parted, but no words came. Her silence was louder than any admission. Finally, Jonathan stood. He picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and looked at her once more. "I'll go back, but I wanted you to hear that question." He stepped past her, walking back down the aisle he had once been forced through in shame. But this time, it was different. People were watching not with pity, but with awareness. Some nodded faintly. A man murmured, "Good for him." Jonathan slid into 3A again, smoothing the seatbelt across his lap. He opened the in-flight magazine once more, flipping to a random page, his hands steady. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had made his point. Caldwell lingered by the aisle, heat rising in her cheeks. She glanced around, but everywhere she looked she met eyes that reflected judgment back at her. She turned quickly, walking toward the galley, her steps hurried. Emily caught her breath. She knew something fundamental had shifted, not just for Jonathan, but for everyone who had witnessed it. Silence had broken. A boy had asked the question none of them had dared. And in Manhattan, Richard Miles ended the call with the board, his voice measured but firm. "This is not just about my son. This is about every passenger who has ever been made to feel less. And it ends now." The cabin of Flight 378 had settled into a strange stillness. Conversations had dwindled to murmurs, the kind people used when they wanted to talk but not be overheard. Jonathan sat quietly in seat 3A, his boarding pass resting like a badge of truth on the tray table before him. He did not fidget, he did not slump, he simply sat, steady and silent, as if he knew that silence itself carried more weight than protest. Passengers stole glances at him. Some offered faint nods of acknowledgement. Others looked away quickly, ashamed that they hadn't spoken earlier. A teenager in row 4 discreetly lifted his phone again, capturing the moment. The energy in the air was shifting. No one could deny it anymore. At the front of the cabin, Ms. Caldwell stood frozen near the galley. She had regained her seat, but not her composure. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She had always prided herself on control of the cabin, of her crew, of the narrative, but now the narrative had slipped away, and she was left in its wake, scrambling for dignity she no longer owned. Emily Parker. Trey, tucked against her side, hesitated nearby. Her conscience screamed at her. She had tried to convince herself that silence was safer, that she was too new, too powerless to matter, but Jonathan's question rang in her ears. "Why did you think I didn't belong?" It was a question aimed at Caldwell, but Emily felt it pressing on her too. Why hadn't she spoken? Why had she let fear silence her? Caldwell suddenly turned, her eyes sharp, her tone clipped. "Emily, resume service. We still have a schedule." Emily's throat tightened. She looked down at the tray, then back at Caldwell. "Ms. Caldwell," she said quietly, but her voice trembled with more than nerves. "He showed you his ticket. I saw it." The words landed like a crack of thunder in the quiet cabin. Passengers lifted their heads. Caldwell's face stiffened, her eyes narrowing in warning. "Emily," she said, voice low, "dangerous. This is not the time." But Emily pressed on, the weight of silence finally breaking. "No, ma'am, this is exactly the time. You told him he didn't belong here without checking the system, without even looking. That wasn't procedure, that was prejudice." Gasps rippled through the rows. Caldwell's mouth fell open, stunned that a junior attendant would dare to speak against her in public. Her authority had always gone unquestioned, but now the one person she had expected to remain silent had spoken the truth out loud. Jonathan sat perfectly still, but his heart thundered in his chest. Emily's words had lifted a burden he didn't realize he was carrying. Someone else had seen it. Someone else had named it. Caldwell straightened, her voice icy. "You're jeopardizing your career. Emily, you don't understand how this works." Emily's hands shook, but she lifted her chin. "Maybe I don't, but I know what's right, and I know what I saw." The cabin was electric now. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, no longer pretending indifference. A woman in 2C muttered, "She's right." A man in 5D nodded. The murmur of agreement swelled. Small, but undeniable. Jonathan's phone buzzed again. A new message from his father. "The truth always finds a voice. You don't need to fight alone." He looked up from the screen and caught Emily's eye. For the first time since boarding, he allowed himself a small smile. It was faint, but it carried gratitude. Caldwell, flushed and trembling, tried to regain ground. "Passengers," she said loudly, her smile brittle. "There has been some confusion. It's been handled." "No wait," a voice interrupted from row 4. The teenager who had been recording lowered his phone, his voice firm. "It hasn't been handled. He asked you a question, and you didn't answer it." Caldwell froze. All eyes were on her again. She had built a career on commanding attention, but never had it felt like this attention sharp enough to cut, unforgiving in its clarity. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her authority crumbled under the weight of silence, of witnesses, of truth. Emily took a step closer, her voice steady now. "If we're supposed to treat every passenger with dignity, then that has to mean every passenger, even when they don't look like what you expect." Jonathan exhaled softly, the knot in his chest loosening. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt seen, not just by his father on the other end of the phone, but here, in this cabin, by strangers who had finally found their voices. The intercom crackled suddenly. The captain's voice filled the cabin, measured and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for your patience. We'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Please remain seated as we prepare for landing." But beneath the routine announcement, everyone knew this was no ordinary flight. Something had shifted here, something that would not be erased by the simple act of wheels touching down. Caldwell turned sharply, retreating toward the galley, her composure shattered. Emily remained where she was, heart-pounding but steady. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, letting the hum of the engines carry him forward. He thought of his father's words, of the essay folded neatly in his bag. Freedom is not given, it is claimed. Today, he had claimed something more than a seat. He had claimed his dignity. And for Ms. Caldwell, the descent into Los Angeles would not be the end of this journey. It would be the beginning of her reckoning. The engines hummed steadily as Flight 378 cut through the evening sky, but inside the cabin the air was heavier than before. No one spoke at full volume anymore. Passengers sipped water or pretended to read, but their attention drifted back again and again to row 3, where Jonathan Miles sat quietly by the window. He didn't shift nervously as he had earlier. He didn't clutch his backpack to his chest. Instead, he sat upright, gaze steady, the in-flight magazine still open, though unread. The shame that had burned through him earlier had cooled into something different, resolve. His father's last message lingered in his mind. The truth always finds a voice. Emily Parker moved carefully down the aisle, offering refills. She could feel the way passengers' eyes followed her, some with gratitude, some with curiosity, some with unspoken support. When she reached Jonathan, she paused. "Would you like some water?" she asked softly. Jonathan nodded. "Thank you." The boy's voice was polite, almost too polite, but Emily caught the steadiness in it. He wasn't asking for pity. He was accepting acknowledgement. She set the glass down gently on his tray, her hand lingering just long enough to convey what words couldn't I see you. From the galley, Ms. Caldwell watched. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her jacket again and again, though no crease remained. She had felt the murmurs rise against her, had seen the phone in the teenager's hand recording her silence. Panic churned in her chest. She had been untouchable for years, the unchallenged authority of the cabin, but now her grip had slipped, and the humiliation was worse than anything she had ever dished out. She reached for the service phone, whispering sharply into it. "Control. This is Caldwell. I need..." But the voice on the other end cut her short. "Ms. Caldwell, the executive board has been informed. You are to remain with the crew until further instruction when the flight lands." Her breath caught, but no further discussion. "That is an order." The line went dead. Caldwell stood frozen, the handset still pressed to her ear. Her authority had been clipped midair, and there was no way to regain it. In first class, Jonathan lifted the essay he had carried with him and unfolded it across his lap. The first line always struck him. "Freedom is not given, it is claimed." He traced the words with his finger, a faint smile tugging at his lips. His father had told him the essay would matter one day. Perhaps this was the day. A passenger across the aisle leaned over slightly, speaking just above a whisper. "You handled yourself well, young man." Jonathan looked up. The man was older, silver-haired, with kind eyes. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to his book. Jonathan felt his chest warm with something new, not just pride, but validation. Emily lingered nearby, pretending to tidy the service area, but really keeping an eye on Jonathan. She felt protective now, as though speaking up had shifted something inside her. For the first time in months of training and long flights, she felt she was living the values she had once believed in. The intercom clicked again, the captain's voice even but unmistakably formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables secured. As passengers shifted and buckled in, tension hummed beneath the routine. Everyone knew that the real landing wouldn't happen when wheels touched the runway. But when doors opened and accountability stepped on board, Jonathan's phone buzzed once more. "Proud of you. Son, when you land, walk tall. This moment is bigger than us," he typed back. "Okay, Dad. I'm ready." For the first time since the ordeal began, he believed it. The descent was smooth, the city lights of Los Angeles glowing like a blanket of stars below. Passengers pressed faces to windows, but the glow inside the cabin remained fixed on row 3. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Ms. Caldwell's heart pounded. She stood stiffly at the galley, her breathing shallow. Every instinct told her to maintain control, to deliver the closing announcements with her usual practiced authority. But something inside her knew the moment she opened her mouth. No one would hear confidence anymore, only fragility. When the door finally opened and passengers began to disembark, the atmosphere was unlike any she had felt before. People moved quietly, but their glances spoke volumes. A few lingered on Jonathan, subtle nods of respect. Others looked directly at Caldwell, their expressions hard. Jonathan rose, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. He looked at Caldwell once more. Not with anger, not with forgiveness, just acknowledgement. She opened her mouth, but no words came. He turned and walked toward the jet bridge, head held high. Behind him, a voice over the intercom called her name. "Ms. Caldwell, please remain on board." Her knees felt weak. For the first time in 2 decades, she walked not with authority, but with the weight of judgment pressing down on her every step. And Jonathan, he walked into the glow of the terminal, a boy who had claimed not just his seat, but his dignity. The jet bridge stretched ahead like a tunnel of light, but for Jonathan Miles, each step felt like a quiet victory. His backpack bounced lightly against his shoulder, his sneakers squeaking softly against the carpet. Around him, passengers filed into the terminal, their faces a blur of fatigue and relief. Yet a few slowed, glancing his way with something more acknowledgement, even respect. Jonathan's phone buzzed. A single message from his father appeared. "I'm at the gate." His heart lifted. He scanned the crowd until he spotted Richard Miles, tall and commanding even in the ordinary chaos of LAX. His suit jacket was off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, but his presence carried the same weight as the skyscraper office he had left hours ago. Jonathan moved quickly, relief washing over him as his father's strong arms wrapped him into a steady embrace. "You did well, son," Richard murmured, his voice low but firm. "I'm proud of you." Jonathan's chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with pride. He looked up at his father. "I didn't yell, I just asked her why." Richard's eyes softened, and that was enough. Behind them, the flow of passengers continued. Emily Parker emerged from the jet bridge, her uniform neat, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She hesitated when she saw Richard, uncertain whether to approach. But Jonathan noticed her and gave a small wave. "This is the one who spoke up," he said quickly. Richard turned, his gaze landing on Emily. She felt her knees weaken under the weight of it, but his expression wasn't harsh. Instead, he extended his hand. "You have courage, Ms. Parker, Emily Parker." She shook his hand, her palm damp with nerves. "You remembered what so many forget," Richard said. "That silence is a choice, and you chose truth." Emily's throat tightened. "I just couldn't stay quiet anymore." Richard gave a small nod, then glanced past her as security officers approached the jet bridge. 2 men in dark suits flanked a woman in uniform, Ms. Caldwell. Her face was pale, her composure cracked beyond repair. Passengers slowed, some openly watching as she was escorted into a side corridor. Jonathan's eyes followed her. He felt no triumph watching her stumble under the weight of judgment, only a kind of heavy sadness. She had believed herself untouchable, but one moment of unchecked bias had unraveled everything she had built. Inside the private conference room adjacent to the gate, Richard led Jonathan and Emily to a quiet corner. Minutes later, the CEO of Atlas Airlines, William Foster, entered with 2 board members. Their expressions were grave, their voices low as they greeted Richard. "Mr. Miles," Foster began, "we deeply regret what occurred today. I want to personally assure you that this will be dealt with." Richard leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "This isn't just about regret. This is about accountability. A child was humiliated in your cabin in front of dozens of witnesses. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. I will not let that stand." Foster nodded, sweat visible along his hairline. "We are prepared to take immediate action. Ms. Caldwell will be suspended pending review, and we will implement mandatory bias and conduct training fleet-wide." "Not enough," Richard interrupted. "Policies are words. I want systems, independent oversight, clear consequences, and I want it written into board governance." The room stilled. The board members exchanged glances. They knew Richard wasn't just a father tonight. He was their largest shareholder, the man who could move markets with a single call. Emily sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but her heart raced as she listened. This was bigger than one incident, bigger than one boy and one flight attendant. This was about an airline, an industry, perhaps even a society forced to confront its blind spots. Jonathan leaned toward his father, whispering, "Dad, will this really change things?" Richard rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "Change begins with one moment, son. One moment that forces people to see what they refused to see before. Tonight, you were that moment." The boy swallowed hard, letting the words sink in. Across the terminal, Ms. Caldwell sat in a separate holding room, her uniform jacket draped across the chair, her hands twisted in her lap. She thought of her years of service, the respect she had demanded, the authority she had wielded. And now, all of it undone by a single assumption, a single refusal to check a boarding pass. For the first time, she wondered if maybe the power she had clung to wasn't real power at all. Hours later, the terminal had emptied, and the Miles family drove home under the glow of city lights. Jonathan leaned against the car window, the day's weight finally pressing down on him. He replayed the moment in his mind: Caldwell's voice, Emily's courage, the hush of passengers waiting for truth. It wasn't anger he carried anymore. It was clarity. His father's voice cut through the quiet. "You know, son, this wasn't just about you. This was about every person who has ever been told they don't belong, even when they had every right to be there." Jonathan nodded slowly. "So, what happens now?" Richard smiled faintly. "Now, we build something better, together." And as the car rolled through the streets of Los Angeles, Jonathan closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in hope. The world might not change overnight, but tonight, something had begun. This story reminds us of something many of us have felt at one time or another: the sting of being underestimated, misjudged, or dismissed because of someone else's assumptions. For older generations, it may call back memories of doors that were closed unfairly, of moments when silence weighed heavier than words. Jonathan's question, "Why did you think I didn't belong?" is not just a child's plea. It is a question we all face when dignity is stripped away. His father's response shows that real strength is not in anger, but in steady resolve, in demanding accountability not just for one person, but for all who might come after. The lesson here is simple yet profound. Moments of injustice are not only personal, they are opportunities for change. By choosing truth over silence, we remind others that respect must never be conditional. In our lives, big or small, we can choose to be bystanders, or we can choose to be voices that say, "This is not right." And in making that choice, we honor not only ourselves, but generations who came before us and those who will follow. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. If Jonathan's story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep telling stories that inspire dignity, justice, and hope.